I stayed in a marriage that slowly broke my heart, not because I was happy, but because of my children. This is the story of the choice that changed my life forever. My name is Mary, and I am 36 years old. I am a wife and a mother. When I first got married, I believed in simple and beautiful things. I believed in love, in partnership, and in the idea of growing old together with the person you choose. I believed that if two people tried hard enough, respected each other, and stayed patient, everything in marriage would eventually work out. In the beginning, it truly felt that way. Life seemed calm and hopeful. My husband would smile at me from across the breakfast table every morning, and that small smile made my whole day brighter. When we walked together, he often held my hand as if he never wanted to let it go. After work, he would ask me about my day and listen carefully to my answers. Those little conversations made me feel important and loved. We were not rich, but we had small dreams that felt very meaningful to us. We dreamed about having our own house one day, raising children, and maybe planting a small garden in the backyard. Sometimes at night we talked about our future for hours. We spoke about it like it was a beautiful country we were planning to visit together someday. Those dreams made me feel safe and hopeful. I truly believed that no matter what happened, we would face life side by side. When my first child was born, everything in my world changed. I felt extremely tired, but at the same time my heart felt completely full. It was a beautiful baby boy, my lovely son. At night, I often held him in my arms and quietly watched him breathe while he slept. His tiny hands and soft face filled me with a deep feeling of love that I had never experienced before. Sometimes I whispered promises to him even though he was too small to understand my words. I softly said, "I am here. I will always be here for you." Those first months of motherhood were very difficult. I barely slept at night. My body ached, and many days I felt completely exhausted. But every time my son looked at me and smiled, all the pain and tiredness suddenly felt worth it. His smile was like a small light that gave me strength again. My husband tried to help during that time. At first, he looked a little confused and awkward when changing diapers. Sometimes he even laughed at himself because he did not know what he was doing. But he still tried. When I was too exhausted to move, he would gently rock the baby at night. Sometimes he would say to me, "Don't worry, we are doing this together." Hearing those words made me feel supported, and I truly believed him. 7 months later, I discovered that I was pregnant again. Life quickly became even more complicated and busy. When my second child was born, our home was never quiet anymore. The house was always filled with noise. One baby was crying, the other was calling my name, and there was always something that needed to be done. My days became very long. I woke up before everyone else in the morning to start the day. I cooked breakfast, cleaned the house, washed dishes, prepared bottles, and tried to organize everything before chaos began again. Sometimes I felt less like a person and more like a machine that never stopped working. My entire day revolved around caring for the children and keeping the house running. By the time night came and everyone finally fell asleep, the house would become silent again. But instead of going to bed immediately, I often stayed awake a little longer. Those quiet minutes late at night were the only moments when I felt like myself again. But slowly, something began to change. At first it was small and almost impossible to notice. My husband was still there, but somehow he felt a little more distant than before. His smiles were not as frequent. Our long conversations about the future slowly disappeared. Day by day, he started changing in ways that I could not fully understand. And deep inside my heart, I began to feel that something in our life together was no longer the same. Slowly, my husband stopped asking how I felt. At first it was small changes that were easy to ignore. He no longer sat beside me on the couch in the evenings. Instead, he chose a chair across the room. When I talked to him about my day, he listened with his eyes but not with his heart. I could see that his mind was somewhere else. Sometimes I showed him the children's drawings with excitement, the little houses, the stick figure families, the bright suns in the corners of the paper. He would look at them for a second, nod his head, and say quietly, "That's nice." Then his attention returned to his phone, as if the moment had already ended. At first, I tried to convince myself that this was normal. I told myself that this was simply what marriage looked like after some years. Life becomes busy. People become tired. I repeated these thoughts again and again, hoping they would make the sadness feel smaller. I told myself that all couples go through this stage. One night, I asked my husband for something very small. I said gently, "Can you help me bathe the children tonight?" He sighed deeply, the kind of sigh that carries frustration. Then he said, "I worked all day. I am very tired. I want to rest." For a moment, I wanted to say something back. I wanted to say that I worked all day too. I wanted to explain that caring for two small children and running a house is also work. But the words never came out. I stayed quiet. So I bathed the children alone. I washed their little hands and faces. I dried their hair with a towel and helped them into their pajamas. After that, I carried them to their beds one by one. By the time I turned off the light in their room, my arms were shaking from exhaustion. I stood there in the darkness for a moment, listening to their soft breathing, trying to gather enough energy to continue the night. There were many other small moments like that. Moments that seemed unimportant on the surface but slowly built a wall between us. Sometimes I cooked my husband's favorite meal, hoping it might make him smile the way he used to. But he ate quietly, without saying thank you, without even looking up from his plate. Other nights, when the children were finally asleep, I asked him if we could sit together and talk for a while. He usually answered with the same words, "I'm tired." When I reached for his hand, hoping for some small sign of affection, he gently pulled away. Not with anger, not with cruelty, just with distance. Over time, I began to feel something strange and painful inside myself. It felt like I was slowly disappearing. I was still there in the house, cooking, cleaning, caring for the children, but somehow it felt like no one truly saw me anymore. Around the same time, money also became tight. We had enough to cover the basics like food and bills, but there was nothing left for extras. Whenever we needed to buy something, the children always came first. I bought shoes for them, books for them, warm clothes for them in the winter. When it came to myself, I simply wore the same clothes again and again. When people asked about it, I smiled and said lightly, "I like these clothes." But deep inside, I knew that wasn't the real reason. One afternoon, while walking through the city, I passed a shop and saw a dress in the window. It was simple but beautiful, soft blue fabric that moved gently in the wind from the open door. I stood there for a long time just looking at it. For a few seconds, I imagined wearing it, walking confidently, feeling like myself again. But then my daughter tugged on my hand and said softly, "Mama, I'm hungry. I looked down at her face and immediately turned away from the window. We walked home, and I never returned to that shop again. Sometimes, very late at night when the house was finally quiet, strange thoughts entered my mind. I imagined leaving everything behind for just a moment. I imagined packing a small bag and walking out the door. I imagined waking up in the morning and deciding what I wanted to do with my own day. In those thoughts, I was not only a wife or a mother. I was simply myself again. But those thoughts never lasted long. Usually my son would wake up crying in the middle of the night, or my daughter would call out "Mom" from her room. The moment I heard their voices, those dreams disappeared. How could I ever leave them? How could I choose myself over the two little people who depended on me for everything? One evening, my husband and I had an argument in the kitchen. It wasn't loud, and there was no shouting. It was just two very tired people speaking words that had been waiting for too long. I said quietly, "You never listen to me anymore." He looked at me and answered, "You never understand me." For a few seconds, we simply stood there in silence. Two people who once loved each other deeply, now standing face to face like strangers who had somehow lost their way. My daughter was standing quietly at the kitchen door. She had been listening to our conversation, though I didn't realize it at first. I only noticed her when she spoke in a small, worried voice. "Mom, Dad, are you fighting?" she asked. The moment I heard her words, I froze. My heart felt heavy because I knew she had heard more than she should have. I forced a calm smile and said softly, "No, sweetheart. We're just talking." But when I looked at her face, I saw the truth in her eyes. They were wide and full of fear. Even though she was young, she could feel that something was wrong. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, my daughter quietly walked into my room and climbed into my bed beside me. She held my arm tightly, as if she needed to be sure I was really there. In a sleepy but worried voice, she asked, "Are you and Daddy going away?" Her question stopped my heart for a moment. Tears immediately filled my eyes. I pulled her close and held her in my arms. I could feel her small heart beating fast against my chest. I gently kissed her hair and whispered, "No, everything is fine." After a while, she finally fell asleep in my arms, but I stayed awake the entire night, staring into the darkness and thinking about everything. That night, something deep inside me changed. I suddenly realized that my children were always watching us. They were learning what love looked like by looking at their parents. They were learning how a husband and wife treat each other, how families solve problems, and how people care for one another. And the truth scared me. I did not want my children to grow up believing that love meant constant distance, quiet sadness, or people slowly drifting apart. I didn't want them to think that love always ended in fighting, leaving, or breaking. After that night, I stopped thinking about leaving, even in my private thoughts. I stayed, not because everything was perfect, but because I didn't want my children to live in fear. I stayed because I didn't want them to feel that their family was broken. I kept telling myself that maybe things would improve one day. Maybe one day my husband would look at me the way he used to. Maybe one day he would truly see me again. Years passed quietly, almost without me noticing. 4 long years went by. Life continued with its daily routines. There were early school mornings when I woke the children and prepared breakfast. There were evenings filled with homework, doctor visits, school meetings, and birthday cakes with candles and laughter. From the outside, everything looked normal, even happy. During those years, I became very good at pretending. At school meetings with teachers, I smiled and spoke politely. At birthday parties, I laughed with other mothers and joined their conversations. If anyone had looked at me, they would have thought I was a perfectly happy woman. But inside, I felt empty, like a room that had slowly lost all its furniture. My husband and I continued living in the same house, but it felt like we were living in two completely different worlds. We talked about practical things, about the children's schedules, the grocery list, or the bills that needed to be paid. But we never talked about our feelings or about what had happened to us. The word us had slowly disappeared from our conversations. Sometimes my husband tried in small ways. Occasionally he brought home food for dinner. Sometimes he asked about the children. He might say, "How was their day at school?" And I would answer, "It was good." But he never asked about my day. He never asked how I was feeling. Each time, a small piece of my heart felt a little more invisible. One afternoon, my son surprised me with a simple question. He looked at me and asked, "Mom, why don't you go out with your friends?" I paused for a moment because I didn't know how to answer. Then I realized something that made me feel strangely sad. I didn't really have friends anymore. I had other mothers that I spoke with at school gates or during meetings, but they were not the kind of friends who truly knew me. I didn't have someone who asked, "How are you?" and waited patiently for the honest answer. So I simply told my son, "I'm fine." But later that evening, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked carefully at my reflection. My eyes looked tired and distant. The woman in the mirror looked like someone who had forgotten how to live her own life. I stood there for a long time, wondering when that change had happened. Just then, my daughter came into the room and gently held my hand. "Mama," she said, "I need help with my homework." I looked down at her small face and nodded. Without saying another word, I turned away from the mirror and walked with her to the table. As the years continued to pass, my children slowly grew older. And little by little, they began to need me less than before. As the years passed, my children slowly became more independent. They started making their own breakfast in the morning. They chose their own clothes before school and solved many of their small problems without asking for help. I watched them grow stronger and more confident every day. In many ways, this was a beautiful thing to see. A mother always hopes her children will grow up capable and independent. I should have felt relief and pride. And in some ways, I did. But at the same time, another feeling quietly appeared inside me, a feeling of being lost. For so many years, my entire life had been built around caring for them. Every decision I made, every hour of my day, had a purpose connected to my children. Now that they needed me less, I began to ask myself a difficult question: who was I without that role? If I was no longer constantly needed, then who was I as a person? It was a strange and uncomfortable feeling, like standing in an empty room after living in a crowded house for many years. One evening, my daughter came to me and wrapped her arms around me in a warm hug. She smiled and said something very simple but very meaningful. "Mom, you always made me feel safe." Hearing those words made me smile, but at the same time my heart felt heavy. I was happy that my daughter felt protected and loved. That was exactly what I had always wanted for my children. But at that moment, another quiet thought appeared in my mind: who had made me feel safe? For many years, I had been the person giving comfort and stability to everyone else. But no one had asked whether I felt the same support. Now, when people ask me why I stayed in my marriage for so many years, I don't give long explanations. I usually answer with a simple sentence: I chose my children. And that answer is true. My children were always the center of my decisions. Their happiness and their security mattered more to me than anything else. But if I am completely honest, that answer is only part of the truth. The whole truth is more complicated. My children grew up in a home where they felt loved and protected. They did not have to experience the confusion and pain that often comes with a broken home. They had stability. They had routines. And they had a mother who was always there when they needed her. At the same time, I slowly learned how to live with what I had lost along the way. Somewhere during those years, I lost the woman I used to be before I became a mother. I lost many of the dreams I once had for my own future. And I lost the kind of marriage I once believed I would have. But while I lost some things, my children gained something important. They gained security. They grew up with stability in their lives. And they had a mother who stayed beside them through every stage of their childhood. Sometimes people ask me a difficult question: was it worth it? Some nights, when the house is quiet and my thoughts wander, I do wonder about the life I might have lived if I had made a different choice. I wonder what kind of person I might have become. I wonder whether I would feel happier or freer. But even with those thoughts, I do not regret the choice I made. I simply carry it with me. Every decision in life has a weight, and this one became part of my story. I carry the memories, the sacrifices, and the person I used to be. And perhaps that is what life often is: a series of choices that shape who we become. If this story touched your heart or made you think about your own life, please support the channel. Don't forget to like this video, share it with others, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more meaningful stories like this.